On the morning of February 6th, 1821, four young men stood on the deck of a small boat out in the Pacific Ocean. The sun was out, it was beautiful and warm, the water was crystal blue, but none of these four men were paying any attention to their surroundings. Instead, all of them were just standing there in total silence, staring at each other. Finally, one of the four men spoke up. His name was Owen Coffin, and he was 18 years old. And Owen, like the other three men, had grown up on the water. In fact, all four of these men had grown up on this small island called Nantucket off the coast of Massachusetts, where the main industry there was whaling, which meant sailors like these four men would go out and hunt whales and slaughter them for their oil. So, from the time Owen and the rest of these men were very little, they were out on the water learning how to sail, and they were also learning the customs of the sea. And there was one custom in particular that Owen wanted to talk about right now with the other three men. So, in a very serious and hushed tone, Owen asked the question of the other three men that sailors referred to as the delicate question. And after Owen asked the so-called delicate question, the other three men, who were already very serious and just kind of standing there in silence, suddenly their eyes started to go wide and their mouths went agape. And then again, all of the men just kind of fell into total silence. The only sound they could hear was the splashing of the waves against the side of the boat. The captain of this vessel was a man named George Pollard. He was 28 years old, and he was actually Owen's older cousin. And what George wanted to say to Owen in response to his delicate question was no. But George didn't say that. Instead, he just put his hands up over his mouth and stared kind of incredulously at Owen and the other two men who were also teenagers. Their names were George and Barzillai. And as he stared at these other three men, he realized that their answers to the delicate question was a resounding yes. They knew it had to be a yes. They had to do this. And even though George could totally override them because he was the captain and so technically in charge, he knew in this situation, under this particular custom, he couldn't overrule them. And so, with his hands still over his mouth, George just nodded a yes. Yes, let's go forward with this custom. And so, with a unanimous decision to move forward, Owen slowly reached down and pulled out the ship's logbook from underneath one of the seats behind him. And then he opened up the book and he flipped to the back pages of the logbook, which were totally blank, and he grabbed one of the pieces of paper and he ripped it out of the book. Then Owen began to rip this piece of paper into strips. First, he ripped 3 identically long pieces of paper, and he held up all 3 at the same time to show the others that these are the 3 that are the same. And each of the 3 nodded their head, yes, we see that. And then Owen reached down, he grabbed the paper again, and he ripped a 4th strip out, and this one was dramatically shorter than the other 3. And so Owen held up this much shorter piece, and he showed Charles, George, and Barzillai, and again, they all kind of nodded in agreement, yes, we see, that's the short piece. And so once the whole group was satisfied that they had their 4 strips, Owen took off his hat, he put all 4 of the strips inside, mixed it around, and held out his hat. It was time. The first man to reach into Owen's hat was Owen's older cousin and the captain, George. He reached in, he pulled one of the strips of paper out, closed it in his fist so he had no idea which one it was, and pulled it back and held it close to his chest. And then one by one, each of the other men did the same thing, reaching in, grabbing their strip, not looking at it, and holding it against their chest. And then once all the strips had been taken, at the exact same time, all 4 men extended their hands into the middle of the circle they were standing in, and they opened their hands palm up to reveal which strip they got. And George, Charles, and Barzillai all had the identical long pieces, and Owen, the 18-year-old, the younger cousin of the captain, the one who had ripped up the strips, he had the short strip. And immediately, when his older cousin, George, saw this, he yelled out, "No, let me take that one." But Owen said, "No, this is customary. I want this." And so after a few moments of the men kind of collecting themselves and calming down, Charles then grabbed the logbook again, flipped to the back of it, pulled out another blank page, and he ripped it into strips again, except now he was only ripping them into 3 strips, 2 long that were identical and 1 short. And once again, as he ripped them, he held them up to show the other men, to show this was a fair process. Then Charles took off his hat, put the 3 strips inside, and extended it to George and Barzillai. Owen was not a part of this round. And so George and Barzillai, one by one, reached in, took their strip, held it to their chest, and then Charles, he would take the last strip, he would hold it to his chest, and then once all the men had their pieces, they held their hands out into the middle of their now smaller circle, they opened their hands, palm up, and this time it would be Charles, the man who ripped up this second round, who would discover he had the short strip. And as soon as Charles saw this, he threw it on the ground and he ran to the other side of the boat and began screaming, "I can't do this! I can't do it!" Meanwhile, Owen, George, and Barzillai didn't even move or flinch. They just stood there waiting for Charles to calm down. Because they knew he knew this was a very important custom, and once you begin doing it, you can't just stop. Charles would have to come back over and play his role. And so after a few minutes of Charles still kind of calling out that he couldn't do this, tears are coming down his face, he finally wiped the tears, he calmed himself down, and he walked back over to the group, who again, they hadn't moved. George, Barzillai, and Owen, they're just standing there waiting to continue this custom. And so as Charles began coming back over, looking ready to continue, George, without even saying anything, reached down and unlatched a door on the side of the boat. He opened it up, he reached in, and he pulled out this long object that was wrapped in canvas. And then he handed this object to Charles. And then once Charles had possession of this object, Owen, the man who had first drawn the short piece of paper, said to the group, "Now it's time for a moment of silence," even though at this point none of the men were talking. But still, they formed a tight circle with Charles holding this object, and they all bowed their heads, and they just stood there in total silence. And then, once Owen raised his head, the other 3 did as well, and Owen, one by one, touched the shoulders of each of the men and reminded them that this had been a fair process. Then, without saying another word, Owen turned away from the group, he walked over to the edge of the boat, looking out over the water, he got down on his knees, he made sure his posture was good, and he looked out over the water. Owen had always loved the ocean, even though his own father had died out at sea. But this particular whaling expedition that Owen had been on, he thought went extremely well, and he was very proud of what they had all accomplished. And Owen was especially proud to be a part of this particular custom. This custom was one that so few people ever took part in, but all sailors knew about it. It was kind of like the forbidden custom. And here he was playing a central role, which really required a lot of strength. And so, feeling very proud of himself, Owen, after looking out over the water for a few more moments, he bent down and put his chin on the edge of the boat, which signaled to Charles it was time. And then once Charles saw that Owen was in position, he stepped away from George and Barzillai and walked over to Owen, carrying this object wrapped in canvas. And then once he was right behind Owen, without saying a word to him, he unwrapped the object. And it was a rifle. And once the rifle was uncovered, he placed the barrel against the back of Owen's head, and then he fired a shot. And instantly, Owen slumped to the ground, dead, and Charles kind of staggered back and fell on the deck and let out this strangled scream. He couldn't believe what he had just done, but he knew there was no other choice. Once they decided to do this sacred custom, they had to take it to the end. And so George, who had just witnessed the execution of his younger cousin, was deeply troubled and pained, but he too knew they had to bring this custom to the finish line, which meant it was George's turn to step forward and play his part. And so George walked up to his now dead younger cousin, and George pulled out a serrated knife and cut off Owen's head. And then once Owen's head was removed, he placed it on the deck so Owen's face was looking away from the other men, like he couldn't see what they were going to do. And then once the head was in place, George went back to Owen's body and began cutting him open and pulling his organs out and handing them to Charles and Barzillai. George also began cutting off long strips of Owen's flesh, creating sort of like fillets. And then, even though there was a spot on the boat to have a fire, the three men decided they just could not wait. And before long, the only sound that could be heard on board this little boat floating out at sea on the Pacific Ocean was the sound of Charles, George, and Barzillai tearing into Owen's raw flesh with their teeth, turning their beards bright red with his blood. The delicate question that Owen asked the other men at the beginning of this story was one of the most feared questions amongst sailors. And it was only asked if there was a shipwreck or some sort of emergency that happened out at sea, which meant the group had almost no chance of survival. Only in those circumstances was the delicate question appropriate. And what it was, do we draw lots to determine which one of us dies so the other can eat them in order to have a better chance at survival? And so during that first round, when Owen had drawn the short strip of paper, that determined he would be the one who was murdered and eaten. And then in the second round, when Charles drew the short strip of paper, that meant he would be the one to kill Owen. On February 6th, 1821, the day that Owen posed the delicate question, he and the other three men had been lost at sea for the past 3 months after a whale had struck the side of their whaling boat and left them adrift with almost no food and no water. There had been other men on board the Essex who had died from starvation and exposure, and their bodies had been consumed by the surviving sailors until on February 6th, they were down to just these 4 men and no more bodies to eat. Which is why they decided it was time. They had to ask the delicate question. "17 days after Owen sacrificed himself so the others could eat him, another boat happened to drift past the stranded Essex boat, which now only contained Charles and George. Barzillai had died of starvation 5 days after they killed Owen, and Barzillai had been eaten by George and Charles as well. And as this other ship passed by the Essex and they looked on board, all they saw were skeletons of the men that had died and been eaten, and Charles and George were on opposite ends of the boat, curled up in a ball, chewing on human finger bones, trying to get the last bits of flesh off. And their bodies were totally emaciated, their hair and their beards were wild, they looked totally feral. And then when this boat actually came up alongside the Essex and boarded to rescue Charles and George looked terrified. It was like they had totally lost their grip on reality. They had been lost at sea for 94 days and had consumed all of their friends, and so it makes sense they might go kind of crazy. But after this crew was able to get Charles and George fed and get them water and cleaned up, they kind of regained their composure and their sanity, and they were very thankful and happy to be alive. The story of what happened to the crew of the Essex quickly spread all around the world, and in fact, it served as inspiration for Herman Melville to write his classic American novel, Moby Dick. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Kaz 2. A little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, three men launched a 35-foot white catamaran called the Cas-2 from a marina in northeastern Australia, kicking off what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The captain of the Cas-2 was 56-year-old Des Batten, and for months he had been training for this trip. And the two friends that Des was bringing with him on this trip were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69 years old. All three of the men had spent a lot of time plotting their actual course they'd be going on, which was from this marina on the northeastern side of Australia, up and around the north side, and then down the western coast to Perth, which was their final destination and where all three men lived. In total, this trip was supposed to take 8 weeks, and all three men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending an entire 2 months basically just drinking beers and fishing. Now, Des, Jim, and Peter were not the types to blow off responsibility to go party. I mean, they were devoted family men. All of them had been married for 30 plus years. Des had 2 kids, Jim had 4 kids, and Peter had 5 kids. But they were all either retired or nearing retirement, and this trip was going to be kind of a way to celebrate the end of an era. And while all three of them had gone on other big sailing trips, this one easily was the biggest one in terms of the distance they were covering and how much prep went into it and how expensive it was. I mean, this was like 10x the scope and scale of any other sailing trip they had done. And so, on April 15th, 2007, shortly after the three men had launched their boat and kicked off this big trip, Peter's wife would call him just to see how it was going. And she would say, Peter was in great spirits, and she could hear the other two men laughing in the background, and it sounded like they were about to start fishing and maybe have a couple of beers. And so it seemed very much to Peter's wife like this trip was going as well as it could be so far. And so eventually, Peter told his wife that he had to go, he told her he loved her, and then they hung up. Now, Des, who was the captain of the Cas-2, was adamant about safety being the top concern for this trip. Even though all three men were relatively healthy and had a lot of sailing experience, and even though Des was a member of a volunteer marine rescue group and so literally could be called on to go perform rescues at sea, despite all this experience and know-how, before they kicked off this trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through all these man overboard drills on the Cas-2 to make sure they knew how to do it, if for some reason, an emergency arose out at sea. And so the men got really comfortable using all the life-saving equipment and going over all the procedures. And then also, when they charted their course, Des stressed that at no point should they be sailing into open water. They needed to stay close to shore the whole time just because it was safer. And so when Jim began filming a video around 10 a.m. on the day they set sail for this trip, you can clearly see the shore in the background of this video, so they're following the course they had planned. But a couple of hours after Jim had shot that video on the day they left, a woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know Des, Jim, or Peter and had never seen the Cas-2 before, she was fishing in an area called Champagne Bay when she looked out into the water and she saw the Cas-2, a white 35-foot catamaran, sailing east to west across the horizon. And then at some point, as Isabel was watching this boat, which really meant nothing to her, she just happened to be watching it, she saw it make a quick 90-degree turn and began sailing out towards the open ocean away from the coastline. Now, remember, Isabel knows nothing of this boat or its occupants and so has no idea that Des, Peter, and Jim had been so clear about at no point will we sail into the open ocean. It's too dangerous. Stay close to shore. She didn't know that. And so she just saw a ship turning and sailing out to the open water and she thought, okay, whatever. So she didn't go and report what she saw. It was only later on when details emerged about what happened on the Cas-2 that she would later come forward and say, hey, I saw that boat and this is what they did. The next day, April 16th, 2 more people would spot the Cas-2. These were 2 men who also did not know Des, Peter, Jim. They didn't know Cas-2. They didn't know Isabel. In fact, these 2 men didn't know each other. But independently, on this day, they looked out near Champagne Bay and they saw the Cas-2 sailing east to west in the exact same spot that Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, remember, the Cas-2 was traveling from that marina on the northeast side of Australia all the way around to Perth. It was a point A to point B trip. There was no reason the Cas-2 would ever double back and be in the same place 24 hours later, but here we were 24 hours later, and 2 more people are seeing the Cas-2 in the same place that Isabel had seen it, and so that made no sense. But again, these 2 men who saw the Cas-2, they just saw it and thought nothing of it because they don't know anything about this boat. It wasn't until later that they eventually came forward with what they saw. Then, one more day after that, on April 17th, there were these fishermen that were out in their boats a little farther north of Champagne Bay, where Isabel and the 2 other men had seen the Cas-2 on consecutive days. And these fishermen, they spotted the Cas-2. And again, these fishermen do not know the Cas-2. They don't know its occupants. They're just seeing the ship, except this time, the fishermen, when they saw the Cas-2, they thought something was wrong. Because they saw the Cas-2 from a distance, navigating its way fairly close to shore in an area that these fishermen knew was full of coral reefs. It's a very dangerous area to be piloting any ship. In addition, the sail of the Cas-2 was totally ripped to shreds. And so the fishermen, they're looking at the ship, wondering what they're doing, but the pilot of the ship looked so in control as he's navigating his way through the coral reefs that the fishermen thought, okay, he knows what he's doing, so, leave him alone. But again, later on, they would report what they saw. It wasn't until the next day, April 18th, so 3 days after Des, Peter, and Jim had set sail, that anybody realized there was an issue with the crew of the Cas-2. Because on April 18th, a Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and they looked down and they saw the Cas-2 with its badly damaged sails, piloting all around this very dangerous part of the water to be piloting. And so the crew on board the helicopter attempted to radio down to the Cas-2 to see if they were okay, but no one from the Cas-2 called back to the helicopter. And so as they're waiting for a response from the Cas-2, the helicopter crew is watching the pilot of the Cas-2 clearly, navigating the boat in between coral reefs. And it seemed like, despite the damage to the sails, he knew what he was doing. And so to the crew on the helicopter, this didn't really look like an emergency, but it seemed like something worth flagging. And so they called the Marine police and said, hey, we have this ship here that's not responding. We think they're okay, but you might want to come take a look. And so the Marine police, they would come out to the area where the helicopter had said they had seen the Cas-2, and when they got there, the Cas-2 was gone. At this point, the Marine police got some information about the boat, Cas-2, and discovered who owned the boat and who was on this trip, so Des, Peter, and Jim, and the police would get in touch with all of their families, and they would all tell police that besides Peter's wife, who talked to Peter on that morning they left, no one had heard from any of the men. They had gone totally silent since that first day. And so when police heard this, they knew this had to be some kind of emergency, and so a search was launched to find the Cas-2. And 48 hours later, a rescue helicopter that was part of the search was about 80 or so miles off the northeastern coast of Australia when they looked down and they spotted the Cas-2. And it still had all torn up sails, and it was kind of spinning listlessly in the water. And from the helicopter, they couldn't see anybody on board the ship. It was totally vacant on the deck. Now, at this point, authorities really have no idea what's going on with this boat or its occupants. It was possible that maybe they had been hijacked, and so Des, Peter, and Jim could be held hostage down below, along with the people that took them hostage. Or maybe the boat just got stolen and Des, Peter, and Jim are not on this boat, and that it's just the criminals on board, and again, they're down below, hidden from view. So authorities, they don't know, but they decided to take a risk and just send somebody down to get on that boat and just see what was going on. So a rescue officer on board the rescue helicopter named Corey Benson was lowered by a rope where he was dropped into the water, and then Corey swam by himself over to the Kaz-2 and he climbed up the side of the boat and he stepped onto the deck, and right away he noticed it was kind of like eerily quiet on board the boat. There was nobody he could see, and there was no sign of any disturbance, minus the sails of the ship being all tattered. And for a second, Corey thought about maybe calling out for Des, Peter, and Jim to see if they were down below and could come up and solve this mystery. Then he also worried that if he called out, there could be some bad people on board this boat, and he didn't want to draw their attention. And so Corey was quiet and just began walking towards the front of the boat. And as he did, he began to notice signs that people must have recently been on board this boat doing normal things. Like, for example, there was a fishing rod that was cast out into the water that was anchored to a post on the side of the boat that looked like it had just been operated minutes ago. There was a blue mug of coffee that was just sitting on a table that looked like maybe someone had been drinking from it recently. There was a neatly folded t-shirt on another chair with a set of glasses on them. I mean, there was just all these kind of tells that this was a boat that was being used recently. And when Corey actually got to the front of the boat where the captain would stand, he saw the engine was actually still on. It was idling. And so Corey turned it off. Now, at this point, Corey knew his next step was going down the stairs and opening up the door that led into the cabin down below to see if Des, Peter, and Jim were down there. But he also knew when he went down there, despite there being backup up in the helicopter and more people making their way out here, Corey would be all alone if there were criminals or bad people down there. But this was his job. And so after taking a deep breath, he turned and walked down the few steps, and he got to the door that led to the cabin. He grabbed the handle and he opened it up. And the room he was walking into was kind of like a half living room, half kitchen area. And he saw there was this table, and on it was a newspaper that was dated April 15th, so the day the Kaz set sail. And then on the wall behind the newspaper was a calendar where days had been marked off all the way through April 14th. April 15th was not marked off. But also nearby on a table was a computer that was still plugged in and on and looked very much like someone had just been using it. And also there were plates of food that were out that didn't look that old that also seemed like people must have just been eating from them. And then also Corey could see past this common area into the bedroom, and very obviously the bunks inside of there had been slept in. And so basically everything seemed like it was where it should be. There was just one problem. Des, Peter, and Jim were not on this ship. There was no sign of where they were. They were just gone. And there was nobody else on board the ship. It was just completely abandoned with no sign of what happened. Des, Jim, and Peter were never found. And so we have no idea what actually happened to them. Nor do we have any idea why they were seen by Isabel and the two men and the fishermen doing all these weird things, like randomly piloting out towards open water, which totally went against their plan, which was stay close to shore, be safe. Or, why on that second day they were seen in the same spot near Champagne Bay, indicating they had doubled back after going towards open water. That went against their plan, which was point A to point B. Why are they doubling back around? And so unfortunately, this whole thing is just one big mystery that has yet to be solved.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.
On December 20th, 2019, 14-year-old Harley Dilly was on his way to school. It was the last day before vacation, and he was furious with his parents. The night before, he had gotten into a huge fight with them, and as punishment, they had confiscated his phone. That afternoon, Harley did not come home. So his parents called the school to say, hey, have you seen our son? And they said, well, we know he was here today, but we don't know where he went after that. So the parents called some of Harley's friends, and none of his friends had seen him after school. His parents were worried, but they had seen this kind of behavior before. When Harley got really mad, he had a history of running away from the house and staying out overnight. He usually crashed with some friend and they would cover for him, or sometimes he would even sleep in abandoned buildings. And so that day, the police were not called. The next day, when Harley still didn't show up, the parents started to get a little bit more worried, and because their son didn't even have his phone, they had no way of getting in touch with him. And so they finally said, we gotta go to the police. And so the police launched a formal search for him, and right away there was no leads. Nobody knew where he was. Weeks went by, and the family was putting up posters all over town, telling their son that you're not in trouble, please come home, and everybody in the community is out there looking for Harley, but there was just no sign of him. Finally, almost a month after he had gone missing, the police received a tip. The house across the street from Harley's house was a vacant home because the owners were actually renovating the property, so they weren't living there. But they had cameras set up on the outside, and one of their cameras, when they reviewed it, picked up Harley walking towards their property on the day he went missing. And so the police show up at this property, the owners show up, they give them the key, the police go inside, they're yelling for Harley, they check all the doors and all the windows, and everything is locked, there's no sign of a break-in. They go upstairs, and in one of the bedrooms, they see there's a jacket lying on the ground, and it would turn out to be Harley's. It was the same one he had on when he went missing. And next to the jacket on the ground is this weird metal plate. And so after seeing this, the police believe Harley must be up on the second floor somewhere. He must have been hiding out in this vacant house the whole time. They don't know how he got in, but clearly this is his stuff. And so they start yelling for him and walking around the second floor, and it's silence. There's no sign of Harley. And so they go back in the room where his jacket and this plate is, and they look up on the wall, and pretty high up, there's a hole in the wall. And it looks to be about the same size as this metal plate. And they realize this plate is actually a vent cover, and that is a vent. Suddenly, police believe this could be a lot more sinister, that perhaps someone had harmed Harley and then taken evidence and stuffed it into a vent inside of a vacant house. So one of the officers gets a stool, they put it in front of this vent, they climb on top, and they reach in to feel around for more evidence. And as soon as they reach in, they touch something and they pull their hand back out and they say, there's a person in there. And it would turn out the person inside of there was Harley, and he was deceased. Although no one knows exactly what happened to Harley, the leading theory is he climbed onto the roof of this vacant home on the day he went missing, and he looked down the chimney. There was no cap on it, and from his perspective, it looked like he'd be able to fit all the way down to the bottom. But what he didn't know was this chimney was wider at the top, and then as it went down, it got narrower and narrower and narrower, and in fact, the most narrow section towards the lower half, he never could have got through. This was an impossible thing he was trying to do. But regardless, he went in feet first, and he began making his way down, and then about the halfway point, he started to get stuck. And he believed it was because of his big, bulky jacket. And as it happened, he was right in front of this hole in the wall, which was the vent, and so he managed to punch the metal plate off of the vent. He got his jacket off, and he forced it through this hole, thinking that would give him a little bit more room. And it did. He began to sink a little bit further, and then he decides to put both arms over his head to try to make himself as narrow as possible. And it works. He starts to move down, but at some point, he gets completely stuck. And he's struggling to breathe because the chimney is tight in his chest, and he's got his arms over his head, and he's starting to panic, and he lets out a scream. But as soon as he does that, the air coming out of his lungs causes his chest to compress, and he sinks just a little bit lower into that tight section of the chimney. And as soon as he comes to a stop, he tries to breathe back in again, but his chest can no longer expand to its full size, so he can't get a full breath. And so over and over and over again, as he's screaming and yelling for help, he's compressing his chest and sinking farther and farther into this inescapable trap until he reaches a point where he cannot go any lower. And his chest is crushed by the chimney. He can barely catch his breath. His arms are stuck over his head and his feet are dangling off the ground. And that is how he would stay until he suffocated to death. In 2002, Sean Doyle was a 25-year-old bartender who worked at a restaurant in Lower Manhattan in New York City. His regulars described him as a little guy who was very cordial and very friendly. He lived not that far away from the restaurant in an apartment building with his sister Shannon and his dog Emmett. And just down the hall from him was his good friend, 47-year-old Michael Wright. Sean and Michael made an odd pair, not only because of their age difference, but because Michael was actually a huge guy, so the size differential was massive. But they were best buds and they hung out all the time. On December 13th of that year, Sean had just worked a double. He got back to the apartment building and he was ready to cut loose for the weekend. And as soon as he got onto his floor, he looked down the hall and he saw Michael and his girlfriend getting ready to go out for the night. And they flagged him down and said, "Hey, you should join us." And Sean said, "Perfect. This is exactly what I wanted." And so he ran in his apartment, he dropped his stuff, he changed, came back out, and they headed to the bars. That night, the trio had a great time bar hopping all over Lower Manhattan. And then sometime in the early morning hours of December 14th, they decided that they'd had enough to drink, and it was time to go home. Now, where they were was only a couple blocks away from their apartment building, so they decided they would just walk. And so they get out on the street and they start walking home, and at some point, Michael gets the impression that Sean is hitting on his girlfriend. It's unclear what gave him this impression, but apparently he really believed it, because as soon as he saw it, he launched an attack on Sean and started just beating him up in the middle of the street. Witnesses who lived in the apartments that were overlooking the street would later say they heard a scuffle outside and they looked out the window and they saw a big guy wailing on a little guy. Then, with the whole neighborhood watching, the big guy, Michael, picked up the little guy, Sean, and shoved him. And Sean flew backwards and he ran into this plastic chimney that was over this manhole. It was there to let steam escape and also to make sure nobody went in the manhole. But when Sean rammed into it, it toppled over, exposing the manhole, and Sean fell 18 feet to the bottom of it. As soon as he landed, witnesses would say they heard a blood-curdling scream. It would turn out the hole he had fallen into was filled with boiling water and scalding steam because of a nearby steam main leak. When police and paramedics arrived, they heard Sean screaming from the hole, and so they ran over and they get to the edge of the hole and they try to look down to get a look at Sean, but they're hit with the steam and it's so hot, so they back up. And finally the steam clears and they get a look at Sean, and he's just standing in the middle of this hole up to his waist in water. He's obviously in excruciating pain, and he's just reaching up for them, his back is arched, and he's pleading with them to get him out of this hole. They turned off the steam main and they tried to lower something down to him to try to pull him out, but his body was starting to shut down and he couldn't grab on. So they considered sending a person down to try to put a harness on him and try to get him out that way, but even with the steam main off, it was over 300 degrees inside of this hole, so no one could go down there. And so knowing they could not help him, police, paramedics, and other onlookers just had to walk around the outside of this hole with their hands on their heads, listening to Sean's desperate pleas for help. And finally, after 10 minutes of agony, it went quiet. It would take 4 more hours for that hole to cool off enough that they could send someone down to retrieve his body. Judy Melinek, the famous New York medical examiner who did Sean's autopsy, wrote in her book, Working Stiff, that Sean's death was the worst one she'd ever seen in her entire career. His fight with Michael and his fall into the hole did not contribute to his death. His actual cause of death was being steamed alive. But what makes this the worst death ever is that steam burns, no matter how severe, do not destroy nerve endings the way flames do, which means Sean would have felt everything. Michael was charged with second-degree murder. However, it's not listed online whether or not he was found guilty or what his sentence was. In 2003, 27-year-old Kurt Smith was employed as an engineer for the German shipping company called Hapag-Lloyd. Over the past year, he had completed 2 separate 4-month-long deployments with this company, and he enjoyed the work enough that he asked for a contract extension. It was granted, and on July 11th of that year, he boarded the CM London Express to begin his 3rd deployment. 3 months into it, one of the ship's pistons broke. The piston is the part of the engine that goes up and down inside the hollow cylinder of the engine block. They would need to turn off the engine in order to make this repair, and so they made an unplanned stop in Savannah, Georgia. Once they got there, Kurt, along with 7 people under his command, headed down to the engine room to begin the process. Over the next several hours, the men were able to extract the broken piston and put in the new one. But this was back-breaking work. It was so hot in the engine room. What they're moving around is so heavy and cumbersome, and they're all bickering with each other. And at some point, Kurt called out the foreman for being lazy, and the foreman did not like that, and he was very popular amongst this group. And so by the end of getting the piston back in, everybody in there just totally resented Kurt. But ultimately, they got it done, and Kurt cut everybody loose except for the foreman. He told him he needed to stay back and help him ensure all the pistons were properly installed. To do that, they would need to go inside of something called the Scavenger air receiver, which is this tube that's 55 feet long by 5 feet wide with access hatches on either side, and it sits right next to the engine block. Each hatch on either end had 3 latches on the outside that were called dogs. And so Kurt undid the 3 dogs on his hatch and he opened it up. He crawled inside of the tube with his flashlight and he began crawling. And on his left side were these square cutouts, these windows called scavenger ports that looked into each of the engine cylinders. And so Kurt crawled along counting the different cylinders until he got to the 6th one, which is where they had replaced that piston. Meanwhile, the foreman went around to the aft hatch. He undid the 3 dogs. He opened up the hatch. And then using a remote controlled device, he was able to bring the pistons into position safely so Kurt could inspect them through the scavenger scavenger port. The procedure on the ship was if you were inspecting one cylinder, the expectation is you would inspect all of them. And that entire process took about an hour, and Kurt just didn't feel like doing it. He was tired, he had a bad day, he was hungry. And so after he was certain the new piston was working just fine, he kind of rushed his checks on the other cylinders, and after only about 20 minutes, he told the foreman that, yep, we're good, we can leave. So he and the foreman got out, they dogged their hatches, and they headed up to their rooms to change. Their captain had been told they had to leave port no later than 9:30 that night because a huge tanker was coming in and there'd be no space for them. But at 8 p.m., as everyone is running around prepping the ship, somebody noticed Kurt was not at his workstation. The chief engineer called down to the engine room to ask anyone down there if they had seen Kurt, but nobody had. So a sailor was sent down to Kurt's cabin to see if he was in there, but he wasn't. At this point, because they only had about an hour until they were departing, they had to find Kurt. So they sounded the alarm on their ship, which was a little bit premature, but they figured, let's get everybody involved and just find Kurt. And so everybody stopped what they were doing and began searching the ship. During the search, a sailor was down near the Scavenger air recovery space, and he noticed on the forward hatch there was a little piece of rag poking out of the top right corner of the forward hatch, and the lower two dogs were not set. He knew they were having issues getting a good seal on this particular hatch because there was a divot in one of the O-rings. And so he figured someone must have put a rag right over that divot to try to help seal this hatch, and they just forgot to shut the two lower dogs. Now, it did cross this sailor's mind that Kurt could have gotten inside of the Scavenger air recovery space and then somehow got locked inside. And so he did want to investigate. However, there was a very strict policy about who was allowed to actually open up the Scavenger air recovery hatches. And it wasn't the sailor. It was only the foreman, the chief engineer, and Kurt. And so this sailor decided to play it safe and just close the lower two dogs, and then told his superior that there was this weird rag poking out of the forward hatch and that someone should go down there and open it up and see if Kurt's inside. And so his superior went and told the chief engineer. And so as the chief engineer is making his way down to check on this strange rag situation, the foreman, completely independently, had gone around to the back of the Scavenger unit to the aft hatch, so not the one with the rag poking out of it, and he unlocked the three dogs, he opened the hatch, he looked inside and shined his light, didn't see anyone, shut the hatch, locked all three dogs, and then began to walk away right as the chief engineer came down and saw him. And he saw him securing the Scavenger air unit, and he said, hey, I was just coming down here to check to make sure Kurt wasn't in there, and you just checked, right? He's not in there? And the foreman said, yeah, no one's in there, it's all good. And so the two of them, the foreman and the chief engineer, did not check on the rag. They just left. The search for Kurt continued on the ship, but they could not find him. And so as 9:30 was approaching, the captain called the port authority and he said, hey, we're down someone. Can you please send someone out to look around? And so a search on the land began, but they couldn't find Kurt. And so finally 9:30 came around, and the big container ship that was supposed to come in and take their place was just waiting right out in the water for them to leave. And so the captain did his best to linger for another 10-15 minutes, but finally they were forced to leave, even though they had no idea where Kurt was. So they fired up the engine and they left. The general consensus on the ship was that Kurt must have fallen overboard and drowned. Or maybe he ran ashore and ran off, but that was very unlike him. And so an investigation was launched, but it would probably be a while before anybody found out what happened to him. Finally, 2 days later, they arrived in port at Norfolk, Virginia. They powered off the engine and they got the ship ready to be put into harbor mode, where basically they open up all the hatches and they prep it to sit there for a while. And during that process, the foreman went down to the Scavenger air recovery space and he opened up the forward hatch and he found Kurt. Although no one has all the details of what happened to Kurt, the leading theory is 2 days earlier, when he had done that abbreviated check of the engine cylinders, when he had basically cut it short with the foreman because he just didn't want to do it, he had gotten back up to his room and started to think to himself that if anything goes wrong with any of those pistons, that I'm going to be to blame because the foreman was with me and I called the foreman lazy earlier and he doesn't like me, and so he's bound to turn me in. So Kurt decided he would go back down and do a more thorough check. But he didn't want anybody to know he was second guessing himself, and so he was going to do this alone, even though it was a huge no-no to go inside of the Scavenger air unit by yourself. Because if you manage to get stuck in there by yourself, horrible things are going to happen to you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But Kurt was confident, so he headed down, he undogged the forward hatch, he swung it inside, he climbed in with his flashlight, and then somehow, once he got inside, he managed to fall backwards and hit the hatch door so hard that it swung shut, slammed, causing the upper dog to swivel and rotate down and lock him inside. He knew that nobody knew he was in there. He had made sure that nobody knew he was in there. He screamed for help, but nobody could hear him. The ship was so loud as it it was, and being inside of this tunnel, no sounds getting out of it. And so he's looking around thinking what he should do, and he looks back at the door, the one that's sealed right behind him, and he sees the very top crack, there's a tiny sliver of light. Because even though one dog had sealed him in, because the other two had not, there was a little gap in the seal. And so he thought if he can just wedge his dirty rag into that little space and push it out onto the other side, someone will see it, will clearly recognize there's a foreign object hanging off of the forward hatch, and they'll have to open it up and they'll find me. And so once he wedged his rag up and through, he was confident he would be found. And so he slouched down against the back of the hatch and he just sat there waiting to be found. And then a little while later, he heard the sound of somebody not opening the hatch behind him as he thought they would, but instead locking the two dogs, making sure it doesn't open. He must have got up and turned around and screamed for them, but again, they can't hear him. And then a couple of minutes later, on the other side of the tube, 55 feet away, the aft hatch opened up briefly. Somebody shined their light in. It didn't hit him. He tried to yell for them. They didn't hear him. And then he saw them shut the hatch, and he heard the sound of them locking all three dogs. At this point, you got to figure that Kurt's fear is at a primal level. He knows at any moment, if somebody doesn't get him out of here, this is going to become a death trap. And so as he's looking around, just wondering what's going to happen, he would have felt the incredible pressure start to build up in his ears. It would have taken him to his knees, it would have been crushing in his skull, and he would have heard the sound of each of the hatches being pressed up against their O-ring as the room began to pressurize. And then he would have heard the sound of the pistons beginning to churn inside of the engine cylinder right next to him. And at that point, he would know there's no hope. And slowly, horribly, that room would begin to heat up until Kurt was cooked alive.